Introduction, August 1953. Passing under the Westinghouse Bridge. I lay awake most of that late summer night watching the world rush by the sleeper's lower berth window. I was almost 6, and my father was bringing me to Pittsburgh to visit my grandmother, who lived outside the city. The first hint of our destination came with the many steam engines that began passing us in the opposite direction once we'd climbed over the first ridge of the Allegheny Mountains at the Horseshoe Curve. We passed under the Westinghouse Bridge when we were in the dining car. Below us and alongside the Westinghouse plant, Turtle Creek flowed a color yellow I'd never seen before. "There's a story about this bridge," my father said all of a sudden over his coffee. "When they were pouring the concrete, a worker fell into the form. You can't get them out during a pour. They leave them in. He's still in there," he said. I imagined him still in there, still drowning in the concrete, still trying to swim to the top of the pour. Then the valley opened, and while the train rounded the bend overlooking Braddock, the smoke and fire plumes of the Edgar Thomson Steel Works rose beside us. It would have been a layered scene as I imagine it now, all red heat in the foreground and hazy dark profiles of sheds and furnaces behind. Peekaboo morning light reflected past them from the distant Monongahela River. Gas jets fired overhead. Then the view closed again as the train turned into the cut through Swissvale. House, 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 street. House, 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 bridge. The train gained speed along the long cut through Wilkinsburg and all the way to Pittsburgh. That was my introduction to Pittsburgh, passing through one of its major gateways, the Westinghouse Bridge, many years ago. Justifiably, people call Pittsburgh the city of bridges. The official count is 446, more than twice what Venice has. Where Venice's need has arisen from its being built on water, Pittsburgh's has arisen down through the ages from the action of water eroding the land. A topography formed by water. Pittsburgh was once part of a vast swamp at the eastern edge of an epicontinental sea that occupied much of the North American continent some 400 million years ago. Subsequently, these lowland beds were raised to their present height of 1,100 feet above sea level by one of several collisions between North America and Africa. The level line of that original basin and swampland has remained as the ever-present tops of Pittsburgh's present-day highland plateaus. These Pittsburgh plateaus have multiple levels, the result of erosion. Approximately 1 million years ago, the rivers of the Pittsburgh region, the Monongahela, the Ohio, and the Allegheny, flowed differently than they do today, draining northward in the direction of what is now Lake Erie. When the most recent advance of polar ice reached the region 900,000 years ago, as far south as Elwood City, 40 miles north of Pittsburgh, the ice sheet blocked these rivers and pooled a general body of water over the entire region, an area geologists have called Lake Monongahela. Then, as this water gradually drained away, it did so along the earlier riverbeds, except that along major parts of the Allegheny and Ohio, it flowed in an opposite direction. Eventually, the region's entire watershed drained westward and southward into the Mississippi. During this time, the Monongahela also followed a wider and higher course across the future city at about 900 feet above sea level. This wider and higher Monongahela followed two branches, one following its present path, more or less, and the other taking a more northerly route from present-day Braddock through East Liberty, over Bloomfield, Shadyside, and Oakland, and finally across Troy Hill and the northern edge of Polish Hill to rejoin its southern sister at the Point. The relative flatness of these shelf neighborhoods, once scoured by that earlier river, is an inheritance of that prior route of the Monongahela. Over time, as it drained, this ancient river alignment cut yet deeper valleys through that former river bottom, finally reaching its present level of 700 feet above sea level. Junction Hollow, Panther Hollow, 4 Mile Run, and the ravine between Bloomfield and Oakland and Polish Hill are legacies of this more recent action. So, contrary to what most people think, Pittsburgh doesn't actually have hills at all. Rather, it has eroded plateaus with three distinct levels. Plateau tops at about 1,100 to 1,200 feet above sea level, the original epicontinental seabed, eroded intermediate level plateau shelves at about 900 feet, the bed of the earlier higher river alignment of the Monongahela River, and lowland rivers with more recent floodplains along their banks at about 700 feet above sea level. So what patterns do we find in the ways people have inhabited this landscape, and how have these influenced the character of the city's bridges? The early bridges at water level. Since 1800, from the confluence where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers now join to form the Ohio, in a very broad historical sense, the city has grown in stages related to the three plateau levels I just described. Initially, the region's mercantile businesses depended on river transportation and grew along the banks of what we call downtown today. A generation later, glass and iron industries grew out along the level flats bordering the three rivers. This expansion was driven by a need for water for industrial cooling, broad, flat, buildable sites, and barge and then rail access. Early housing initially shadowed the industrial growth along these flats. The neighborhoods of Lawrenceville along the Allegheny River and Birmingham along the Monongahela, both east of the point, were pre-Civil War expansions. As we might expect, the city's first bridges were low to the water, but this was not only for reasons of technology and expense. There was no need for high-level bridges. Few people lived on the upper terraces. Pittsburgh's earliest bridge was built near the present site of the Smithfield Street Bridge in 1818 and was quickly followed by a bridge across the Allegheny in 1819. These were wooden covered bridges, supported by numerous pilings as they crossed from bank to bank. In 1829, a wooden covered bridge was built near the site of the present-day Fort Wayne Railroad Bridge to carry a canal across the Allegheny River. All three of these bridges are shown in this 1828 map of the city. The aftermath of the 1845 fire, which destroyed 1/3 of the Golden Triangle, including the Monongahela River Bridge, would play out in important ways for the history of Pittsburgh's bridges. Facing dire economic consequences with the loss of its major land route to the west, the city turned to John Roebling, who had a steel wire works in nearby Saxonburg. Roebling would later become world-renowned for his suspension bridges, first at Niagara Falls in 1855, then the Cincinnati-Covington Bridge across the Ohio in 1866, and finally the Brooklyn Bridge, which was completed in 1883. But he got his start with suspension bridges in Pittsburgh. At the time of the fire, he was already at work replacing the recently collapsed Allegheny Canal Bridge with a steel wire bridge, his first suspension bridge. The new bridge would connect to the Allegheny Portage Railway, where he had first used wire cables to lift canal boats. 3 weeks after the fire, Roebling had come up with a plan that made use of the existing bridge piers and used triangular stays to carry the cables from which the second Smithfield Street Bridge would be hung. It was completed within months. With Roebling's Smithfield Street Bridge, we see the first instance of a pattern of bridge building in Pittsburgh that as traffic requirements increased with the city's growth, bridges succeeded bridges on the same site. The bridge sites became such essential connectors in the pattern of the city's streets that they required that replacement bridges had to be built on or near the same site. Roebling's Smithfield Street Bridge was then replaced by Gustav Lindenthal's lenticular truss in 1883. This design, which combines an arch with a suspension bridge, has been rarely used in the world, but it is notable for the lightness of its appearance. Along the Allegheny River, Roebling's 6th Street suspension bridge replaced the 1819 wooden bridge. In turn, it was replaced in 1892 by a truss and then replaced by a bar suspension bridge, one of the 3 sister bridges currently there. Whenever an obsolete bridge was replaced, the new bridge would be built right next to it. This pattern of side-by-side replacement continued into the next century. The first point bridge, An unusual suspension bridge built in 1887 was replaced by a second point bridge in 1927, and then a third generation, the Fort Pitt Bridge, replaced it in 1959, just slightly upriver. Further up the Monongahela, the bowstring arch Brady Street Bridge was built in 1896 to replace the 22nd Street Ferry. It was in turn blasted spectacularly into the river below, next to its replacement Birmingham Bridge. So while bridges come and go, bridge sites are a kind of indelible expression of the city's fundamental order. Hot metal bridges. Another pattern we see among Pittsburgh's water-level bridges is tied to the growth of the city's industry. With the growth of the steel industry after the conclusion of the Civil War in 1865, mills were built and expanded upriver into Birmingham, South Oakland, Hazelwood, Homestead, Rankin, and Braddock, and countless other towns along the Monongahela, all to take full advantage of their proximity to the abundant coal fields of Fayette County and West Virginia. By the time the United States entered the First World War, there was a nearly continuous stretch of steel and steel-related plants, one side of the river or the other, and sometimes both, stretching up the Monongahela River Valley as far as Menneson, some 30 miles upriver. At several of these sites, a practice of two mills working in tandem evolved. Jones and Laughlin built their ironworks along the north bank of the Monongahela River on the flats below South Oakland, and their steelmaking furnaces on the opposite south bank. The molten pig iron in the one was poured out of the blast furnaces into special rail cars called torpedoes, and then transported across the river to the other mill, across what came to be called the hot metal bridge. The torpedoes looked like oversized kazoos with their open tops. Once inside the steel facility, their contents were dumped into huge overhead buckets that would carry the molten iron to the open hearths. These trains of torpedoes were a sight to see from the rim of the South Oakland Plateau above when they crossed the bridge with their open lids glowing at 2,000 degrees hot. The term hot metal bridge was well chosen indeed, and this pattern, two mills connected by a bridge, was repeated at several mills further upriver. Second-level plateau bridges, hollows, and the bridges that cross them. With the city's expanding industrial plant, there was need for more housing near mills than could fit on the adjacent flats, and so by the turn of the century, housing began to extend up into nearby hollows. Some of these, Millvale, Munhall, Chartiers Valley, and Turtle Creek, had been formed as eroded tributaries of the Allegheny, Monongahela, and Ohio rivers. Typically, these communities grew as 1- and 2-street-wide linear neighborhoods that followed meandering stream beds along a valley floor. 4 Mile Run, on the other hand, formed out of a drainage course of the earlier northern arm of the Monongahela across the plateau of what is now Oakland. It has 3 arms, Junction Hollow, Panther Hollow, and 4 Mile Run proper. It meets the Monongahela right at the site of the Jones and Laughlin South Oakland Ironworks. The hollow was called Ruska Dolina, Ruska Valley, by its inhabitants, most of whom came there in the last decade of the 19th and the first decade of the 20th century to work in the Jones and Laughlin mill. Most were from the Carpathian Mountains of Eastern Europe, and in 1910 they established a church, St. John Chrysostom Byzantine Catholic Church. We know it today as the home church of artist Andy Warhol, from when he was growing up on the South Oakland Plateau directly above. The Run, as it has come to be called by its inhabitants today, is emblematic of Pittsburgh's hollow communities, where people's lives revolved around 2 centers: the mill at the hollow's mouth, and the church midway up the length of the valley floor. But the Run did not exist in isolation. Though there had long been houses for affluent persons on the upper plateaus, these areas began to fill in with commercial centers and more housing. The growing communities of Oakland on the mid-level plateau to the west and Greenfield and Squirrel Hill to the east could not long remain cut off from one another, and so bridges soon began to appear overhead, in most cases from terrace to terrace. 3 of these were built as part of the creation of Schenley Park, east of Pittsburgh's Oakland district. If ever a valley could be called the Valley of Bridges, it would be this one. Going from north to south, 3 of them, the Schenley Park Bridge, 1897, the Panther Hollow Bridge, 1897, and the Willets Avenue Bridge, 1907, sprang across the 2 arms of the run, Junction Hollow and Panther Hollow, using their steep bluffs to buttress their arches. A 4th near the mouth of the hollow, the Swinburne Bridge, 1915, replaced an earlier bridge at the same location, connecting South Oakland to Greenfield. It is a riveted girder on trussed supports, attached to the bluffs at mid-level on either side. It crosses directly over the houses of the run. The Wilmot Street Bridge is the only one of the 4-mile run bridges that has been removed. It was replaced in 1940 by the Charles Anderson Bridge as an extension of the Boulevard of the Allies into Schenley Park. It uses an unusual design called a Wickert truss. In fact, it is not truly an arch at all, although it looks like one. The structure's main span and side spans are hinged. That is, they're not rigid where they rest on their vertical piers. This lack of connectivity allows them to carry loads independently of each other. At the time, this was understood to be a great advantage because it also allowed the calculations for each part to be completed independently of each other, thereby avoiding the indeterminate calculations of more traditional arches. The Anderson Bridge is one of 2 Wickert trusses in the Pittsburgh area. It was preceded by the Homestead High-Level Bridge by 4 years. Much to the consternation of my friend and former colleague Steve Fenves, a former CMU engineering professor, I have always drawn this bridge, and the high-level bridge too, incorrectly. I have kept a vertical strut on top of the pier. I have done so for purely visual reasons. To my eye, it simply looks better. And over the years, Steve and I have enjoyed teasing each other over my omission. I seem to remember he once even sent me a copy of one of my drawings with the offending member removed. And there are other visual issues that surround the bridges of the run. More recently, in 1952, its visual character was completely transformed when the Parkway East was built along its length, partly on a high berm and partly with a bridge. This 6-lane highway not only dwarfs the neighborhood, it has cut off the neighborhood's spine road, the former Forward Avenue, from its connection up to the terminus of the valley in Squirrel Hill. But its impact is more unfortunate than just that. It has disrupted our sense of the hollow as a place, as a room defined spatially by the walls of the bluffs on either side, a room with a stream bed and a road forming the center of one arm, and a stream bed and a railroad and road running the length of the other. The earlier bridges crossing the run, rim to rim, had not disrupted that order. They crossed it as all bridges have historically crossed rivers, in this case a prehistoric one, from one side to the other. But the Parkway Bridge has taken away the center of the hollow, and as a consequence, the hollow has been diminished. This pattern of bridges crossing hollows top to top is found elsewhere in our city. Woods Run drains a large part of the plateau north of the Ohio River. It is a meandering hollow with Woods Run Avenue running much of its length and paralleling a stream that is fortunately still visible. The small community has several churches and a few stores. To me, its most prominent characteristic is the compelling window to the sky that it offers. This owes partly to the sharp rims of the bluffs that frame the view above on both sides, but in addition, the view is profoundly accented by the 2 arched bridges that fly overhead at its mouth, the Ohio River Boulevard and the California Avenue bridges. One of Pittsburgh's most prominent plateau-to-plateau bridges is the Bloomfield Bridge, constructed in 1914 to connect the communities of Bloomfield and Polish Hill. It was replaced in 1986. It serves the same purpose as the Bridges Crossing 4-mile run, joining two, by this time well-established plateau communities. Without the bridge, these two neighborhoods would have remained connected by only a roundabout route 1.5 miles long. Also like the bridges crossing the run, the Bloomfield Bridge spans that same ancient northern course of the Monongahela River. What it crosses, however, is not a neighborhood. It traverses the most important 19th century overland transit route in the city, the main right-of-way of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which played such a key role in supporting Pittsburgh's maximum years of growth from 1865 to 1920. The railroad reached Pittsburgh in 1850. It followed the basin of the Monongahela River's northern arm, simply because of the gentle grade that follows, a shallow cut rising slowly from Swissvale through Wilkinsburg to a high point at East Liberty, and then descending gently again past Shadyside and Bloomfield to the flats now called the Strip, and finally to a terminus at the northern corner of the downtown. The route's many stations, 6 between East Liberty and Heron Hill alone, allowed these various neighborhoods to expand towards one another. The first Bloomfield Bridge deck spanned 150 feet above the roadbeds of the railroads in the ravine below. It was simply not feasible to support the bridge during construction with centering from below. The bridge was therefore designed as a cantilevered truss, with both ends constructed with cranes working from either end toward the middle. By far the most spectacular plateau-to-plateau bridge in Pittsburgh is the George Westinghouse Bridge over the Turtle Creek Valley, which was completed in 1932. This is the bridge that had provided such a memorable gateway to the city for me as a child. Like the Bloomfield Bridge, it greatly shortened what had been a tortuous route across a valley. It started from the East Pittsburgh bluffs above, descended the slope to the valley floor, went around the Westinghouse plant, crossed Turtle Creek and multiple railroad rights-of-way, and then climbed to the other side. Except here, the need for a bridge across was even more dire. This detour was a major bottleneck along the most important east-west automobile route in the United States at the time, the Lincoln Highway, U.S. Route 30. What I find personally compelling about the experience of driving across the Westinghouse Bridge today is the approach from the northwest, from the point where Electric Avenue peels off to descend to the Westinghouse plant and Turtle Creek below. There, we round a bend around a high bluff on the right and see for the first time the bridge that will carry us on 5 leaping arches across all of what we briefly glimpsed below us just moments before. Then we pass several churches below on the left, though it is a view that has closed up in recent years with a thick overgrowth of scrub trees on the left. It is a view that in winter still holds our attention for a good quarter mile of driving. I have drawn this approach numerous times over the years. For years, people have praised the impact the bridge has on the visual order of the valley itself. Built at a narrow neck in the valley, it encloses one valley room and opens to another. Many say it gives a welcome unity to the valley. It ties together its otherwise confusing hodgepodge of rail yards and factory sheds with its dominant white profile. It surely does serve as the valley's dominant landmark, and it projects over great distances in multiple directions, terminating the view from plateaus to the east and visible from the top of Kennywood Park's great roller coasters more than a mile away across the Monongahela River to the west. Tunnels and bridges. Downtown Pittsburgh's growth to the south was long blocked by the 3-mile-long ridge called Mount Washington, which borders the south bank of the Monongahela River directly across from the downtown. At 1,371 feet above sea level, it's part of the original inland seabed. It rises more than 600 feet above the river, and there are few breaks along its length. Over the years, there have been several bridge and tunnel combinations that have passed through this formidable barrier to reach the hills south of the city. The first was the Wabash-Pittsburgh Terminal Bridge and Tunnel, which was completed in 1904. This ill-fated project was part of Jay Gould's vision to create a transcontinental railroad from Baltimore to San Francisco. Little remains of the project. The bridge, an enormous cantilever through truss, was torn down in 1948. Its huge piers are still there on either side of the Monongahela River. The tunnel is now used for high-occupancy vehicles. The most recent tunnel-bridge combination, the Fort Pitt Bridge, was part of a larger plan begun in the 1950s to replace the bridges at Pittsburgh's Point with a park and fountain, and then construct two new bridges across the Monongahela and Allegheny Rivers. One of the early designs was provided by Frank Lloyd Wright through his patron Edgar Kaufman. It would have suspended the pair of bridges from a towering central mast, but the project was rejected as way too costly. Eventually, two bowstring arches were designed to provide a throughway to the north side and to the North Hills and the suburbs east of the city. The Fort Pitt Bridge was opened in 1959, and the tunnel was opened in 1960. Today, the Fort Pitt Bridge affords one of the most spectacular experiences of entering a city in America. Motorists suddenly emerge from the suburban world of the South Hills through the tunnel to a dramatic view of Pittsburgh's downtown skyscrapers. It is the bridge that was built midway in time between these two bridges, the Wabash and the Fort Pitt, that has always captured my interest as a subject to draw. The Liberty Bridge was completed in 1928, 4 years after the completion of the Liberty Tunnel. Along with the 1904 Pittsburgh Railway's streetcar tunnel, it was the principal driver of the growth of Pittsburgh's most important South Hill suburbs of Dormont and Mount Lebanon. But it is our experience of this bridge that I've wanted to capture in drawing it. Coming from the south and emerging from the tunnel out onto the high deck of the Liberty Bridge, a dramatic panorama of the city suddenly opens. Like the Fort Pitt Bridge experience, the view is made all the more compelling by the fact that there has been no visual cue of a nearby city when we enter the tunnel through the south face of Mount Washington. Reaching the north bank of the river, the bridge remains high up over the streets below. Then we cut along the eastern edge of the Golden Triangle, past the Epiphany Church and downtown towers on the left. And then, unexpectedly, just as we're heading towards the Veterans Bridge across the Allegheny River, a flyover of ramps descends, seemingly from out of nowhere overhead. For many years, my studio was located in the terminal building under the shadow of the Liberty Bridge viaduct between the tunnel and the main river spans. Because I worked so close by, I experienced the bridge as a neighbor. I was on the ground floor, and from my garage door entrance, I had a front row seat view of all of the activities of unloading and offloading that went on all day long at the Bryant Concrete Company across the street beneath the viaduct. At the end of the street by the river was a crane that unloaded gravel, sand, and cement from the barges docked along the bank, and then dumped these into a hopper from which they were conveyed up a long belt to make concrete. My favorite trips have been descending or ascending the long viaduct, the McCardle roadway that connects the South Side flats to the Liberty Bridge some 80 feet above. From the tunnel above, the winding descent takes us on a cinema-worthy journey. It takes us through a truss bridge, over a railway right-of-way, and past the magnificent roofscape of cupolas atop St. John the Baptist's Byzantine Church. Passing the vast green football field of the Southside Stadium, we land in the flats and its brick row houses below. The experience of the bridge from below puts us in a different world altogether. There, a homeless community occupies the undercroft of the viaduct within sight of St. John the Baptist's many cupolas overhead. Bridges, our mental map, and the civic meaning of bridges. Views down over Pittsburgh's many bridges form central parts of our mental image of the city. Because our rivers are such a ubiquitous presence, it is rare that we find ourselves in a neighborhood far from a bridge. Bridges take us from neighborhood to neighborhood. They are the routes over the innumerable hollows and waterways that define so discernibly the boundaries of our neighborhoods, and sometimes they're the only way into or out of them. My drawings of the city have peekaboo foregrounds, with intimate neighborhood scenes of people on porches and side yard barbecues juxtaposed with distant views of rivers gleaming in the background with bridges crossing them. Occasionally, a church spire or cupola will interrupt the continuous ribbon of the river beyond. Pittsburgh's bridges are always present in these views. They are the connective tissue in our conception of the city. But in closing this talk about Pittsburgh's bridges, I want to touch on their broader meaning as instances of this universal fixture of human infrastructure. Bridges have been used as profound metaphors throughout our literature and song. Some touch on their inherent risk, whether in building them or crossing them, the Bridge of St. Louis Rey. Some center on the nature of what they allow us to pass over, bridge over troubled waters. And some, I'm thinking here of biblical references to crossing the River Jordan, direct us to the act of crossing over itself, crossing over to a new and better place on the other side. So bridges mean something. They have cultural and spiritual significance. How might our bridges live up to, or fail to live up to, their role in carrying this considerable cultural weight? To be sure, there are many bridges that need be nothing more than ordinary. For a simple truss over a railroad track or a small creek, we have no requirements other than that the bridge be well crafted and safe. But for major bridges, where we have invested much time, effort, and public treasure in their creation, we should place demands on their design such that they fulfill their rightful roles in the life of our city. Let's now look critically at two replacement bridges in our city's history. I mentioned earlier that the Bloomfield Bridge, constructed in 1914, was replaced in 1986 by a new bridge. There was ample reason to replace that original bridge. By the time it was removed, the old one was rusting badly. It was inadequate in meeting the traffic demands that had increased in the years since its construction. But did this new Bloomfield Bridge have to be so banal? It uses steel girders set on tall concrete piers. It is simple, but completely lacking in scale. Nothing marks its beginning or end other than on or off ramps. Its construction has no parts which are relatable in size to the nearby 2- and 3-story frame houses that border the ravine it crosses. And the new bridge took even longer to build than the old one. It took 6 years to find funding and 2 years to construct, where the original took only 1 year. Consider, on the other hand, the 16th Street Bridge built in 1922. It replaced a bridge at the same location called the Mechanic Street Bridge that dated back to 1838. The 16th Street Bridge offers a beautifully choreographed crossing of the Allegheny River between the north side and the Strip District. Beginning at the top of a viaduct leading to the main spans, 2 flanking stone piers provide a gateway to the bridge. These are topped with memorable globe sculptures with horses' limbs extending outward. The bridge itself consists of 3 through arches. Because their sizes vary in length and height, the 2 ends are 240 feet long, and the middle one 437 feet long, the experience of crossing it has temporal and spatial rhythm. Short, long, short, and lower, taller, lower, as we move across the sequence of its 3 spans. It is with this idea that significant bridges must celebrate the act of crossing over that I want to leave you with as I close this brief talk. The experience of crossing over them should be distinct in itself. It should not be the undifferentiated experience we find in crossing the new Bloomfield Bridge, not even the slightest markers for its beginning or end. Bridges need introductions. We might see them from afar as we do the Westinghouse Bridge in order to anticipate crossing them. At other times, we might see them rising in the distance as we do when we view the McKees Rocks Bridge from the viaduct crossing the bottoms. We should know when we have reached them in the way that that same bridge provides gateway portals to its main span at either end. And some bridges even have the good fortune by their placement to offer some sense of their destinations, as we see with the extraordinary panoramic views of the other side offered by both the Fort Pitt and Liberty bridges.